It sat in the middle of the paddock like a wound that refused to heal. A 1950s Ferguson tractor, its orange paint flaking away to reveal the brown bone of rust beneath, surrendered to 70 years of Scottish rain. By all accounts, it was worthless. It was scrap metal waiting for a price that would never come. But the machine descending from the grey clouds above suggested otherwise. The sleek black helicopter cut through the drizzle, its rotors flattening the long grass in widening circles. Inside sat Owen, a man whose signature moved markets, staring down at that rusted carcass not with disgust, but with a terrifying hunger. He hadn't flown 3,000 miles for nostalgia. He came because the stillness of this valley was finally about to break. The valley itself was a place where time didn't flow so much as pool and stagnate. It was a hollow in the landscape that held the damp like a held breath. The air always smelled of wet wool, ancient peat, and the slow chemical decay of things left behind. In the centre of this stillness stood the tractor. It had been parked there in the autumn of 1953 and hadn't turned a wheel since. Over the decades, the tyres had rotted away, leaving the steel rims to sink slowly into the mud, fusing the machine to the earth. It wasn't just parked, it was anchored. To the casual observer, it was an eyesore. The bright orange livery of the Ferguson had long since dulled to the colour of dried blood. Moss grew in the crevices of the seat, and a family of wrens had nested in the exhaust pipe for 3 generations. But if you looked closer, really looked, you might notice that the decay was uneven. The sheet metal was pitted and scarred, yes, but the frame held a rigidity that defied the damp. It stood less like a discarded tool and more like a sentinel. A statue erected to watch over nothing but the rain. The locals in the village 3 miles down the road had a name for it: the Iron Ghost. They remembered Old Man Galloway, the farmer who had worked this land until his back gave out and the bank took everything but the house. They remembered how he sold the sheep, the cows, and even the plough. But he never sold the tractor. When the scrap merchants came around in the 60s, offering good money for the metal, Galloway had chased them off with a shotgun. He was a quiet man, usually, beaten down by the hard years, but on the subject of that tractor, he was immovable. He told them it wasn't his to sell. He said he was just keeping it until the owner came back. He would walk out to it every night, rain or shine, checking the locks, wiping down the hood, treating a heap of rust like a holy relic. They called him mad, of course. That's what you call a man who starves while sitting on a pile of assets. But madness is often just a truth that hasn't found its context yet. Galloway died in the 80s, taking his reasons with him, and the farm passed to a nephew who had no interest in mud or mysteries. The tractor stayed, becoming a landmark for hikers and a nuisance for the sheep. It became part of the geography, as permanent and unremarkable as the stone walls that lined the fields. It was just another piece of junk in a world full of it. But objects have a memory. In the world of high-end auctions and museum archives, they call it provenance. It is the paper trail that turns a dirty canvas into a masterpiece, or a chipped cup into a royal relic. Provenance is the story that gives an object weight. To the right eyes, the tractor was not debris. It was a marker on a map that hadn't been read in decades. It was a coordinate. It was a promise made in ink and iron. The rain began to fall harder, blurring the horizon, washing the grime off the metal hood. It was the kind of rain that felt intentional, designed to wash away the present and leave only the bones of the past exposed. The tractor sat there, enduring it all, as it had for 25,000 nights. It was waiting. It didn't care about the moss or the rust or the opinions of the people who drove past on the main road. It only cared about the contract made in silence 70 years ago. Most people look at a ruin and see an ending. They see failure, abandonment, the slow victory of nature over machine. But a ruin is only an ending if you don't know how to read it. For those who know the language of secrets, a ruin is a container. And sometimes, the uglier the shell, the more valuable the pearl inside. The valley was quiet, save for the rhythm of the water hitting the metal, a drumming sound that had been the heartbeat of this field for a lifetime. But maps are useless without someone who knows what they are looking for, and the man stepping out of the helicopter knew exactly what he was looking for. The rotor blades slowed to a lazy, rhythmic thrum before finally surrendering to the wind. As the mechanical whine died away, the heavy isolation of the valley rushed back in to fill the void, claiming the space with a jealous urgency. The door of the helicopter slid open, and a man stepped out into the grey wash of the afternoon. This was Owen. To the rest of the world, he was a titan of industry, a man whose name was synonymous with the invisible architecture of the 21st century. He dealt in cloud computing, in the ethereal streams of data that bind the globe, and in the quantum processors that promise to solve the unsolvable. He was a creature of glass offices and sterile server farms, a man who lived his life in the climate-controlled future, far removed from the dirt and the damp. But here, standing ankle-deep in the sodden earth of a sheep paddock, he looked like an astronaut stranded on a dying planet. There was a violent visual dissonance in his presence. He wore a coat that likely cost more than the annual yield of the entire farm, a masterpiece of synthetic engineering with sharp geometric lines that repelled the rain in perfect beaded spheres. It was matte black, absorbing the light, a void in the landscape of muted greens and browns. The fabric was a polymer weave, designed to withstand conditions far harsher than a Scottish drizzle, yet here it seemed almost fragile against the overwhelming weight of the landscape's history. Against the chaotic organic decay of the valley, the rotting fence posts, the tangled briar, the weeping stone walls, he looked artificial. He was a vector of modern precision, intersecting with a world of slow, biological entropy. Most men of his station, finding themselves in such a desolate, rain-soaked purgatory, would have moved with haste. They would have hunched their shoulders against the cold, cursing the mud that sucked at their boots, eager to conclude their business and retreat to the warmth of the cabin. Owen did not run. That was the first indication that this was no ordinary transaction. He stood perfectly still for a long moment, letting the rain hammer against his hood, breathing in the scent of wet wool and ancient soil. He treated the mud not as a nuisance, but with the graveness one might accord a clean room in a Silicon Valley laboratory. He looked at the ground with reverence, as if the slurry of earth and sheep tracks contained data as valuable as any line of code. When he finally began to move toward the tractor, his pace was measured. He lifted his boots with deliberate care, placing them down to disturb the earth as little as possible. He wasn't trudging, he was processing. His eyes were fixed on the rusted hulk in the distance, but there was no confusion in his gaze, no hesitation. A tourist looks at a ruin and sees what has been lost. Owen looked at the tractor and saw what had been saved. He wasn't here to buy a piece of history for a private collection. He wasn't here to strip the assets of a bankrupt estate. He was here because a clock that started ticking before he was born had finally struck the hour. The internal monologue of a man like Owen is usually a ticker tape of valuations and risk assessments, but as he closed the distance to the machine, the noise of the market faded. He was here to close a loop. For decades, this location had been a set of coordinates in a secure file, a digital ghost haunting the periphery of his inheritance. He knew that what lay beneath that orange rust was not just machinery, but a legacy that had been waiting for him to grow tall enough to reach it. It was a burden of knowledge that had isolated him, even in crowded boardrooms. He had flown across an ocean, not to find something new, but to retrieve something that had been left behind on purpose. The solitude of the valley was heavy, but the tension between him and the machine was heavier still. It was the pressure of a breath held for 70 years, waiting to be exhaled. He stopped a few feet away, the rain dripping from the brim of his hood, and simply watched. He was ready to assume the weight, but he wasn't the only one guarding the secret. From the shelter of the crumbling stone byre, another figure watched the approach. This was the current steward of the land, a man named Ewan, though in the grand ledger of this valley's history, his name was less important than his bloodline. He was the great-nephew of Old Man Galloway, inheriting the farm along with its debts, its leaking roofs, and its rusted superstitions. He did not share his ancestors' reverence for the machine in the field. To him, the tractor was a nuisance, a heavy, jagged obstacle that forced him to plough in awkward circles. It was a burden of inheritance, a clause in a will he couldn't contest, sitting there like a stubborn guest who refused to leave the party long after the lights had gone out. He walked out to meet Owen, his boots sinking deep into the slurry. He wore a wax jacket that had seen better decades, cracked at the elbows and smelling of diesel and wet dog. There was no awe in his face as he looked at the billionaire, only a weary practicality. He had seen men with money come to the Highlands before. They usually wanted to buy a castle, or a title, or a silence. He assumed Owen was here for the latter, though he couldn't fathom what silence was worth buying in a paddock occupied only by sheep. The two men stood on either side of the tractor, separated by the rusted hood. The rain fell between them like a beaded curtain. There were no pleasantries, no comments on the weather. In this part of the world, the weather was not a topic of conversation, but a fact of life, like gravity. Owen did not reach for his checkbook. He did not offer a number that would change Ewan's life, though he certainly could have. Instead, he reached into the inner pocket of his waterproof coat and withdrew a flat, plastic-sealed envelope. From it, he pulled a single sheet of paper. It was not a digital printout. It was heavy, cream-coloured bond, the kind that hasn't been manufactured in half a century. The edges were yellowed, the creases deep and fragile. Owen held it out, shielding it from the rain with his body. Ewan took it, his rough, calloused fingers brushing against the smooth, expensive fabric of Owen's glove. He looked down at the document. The ink was faded to a sepia brown, but the signature at the bottom was still legible, sharp and angry. Alistair Galloway, 1953. The silence that followed was heavier than the rain. Ewan read the words, his lips moving slightly. It was a deed of release, but it was also a contract of custody. The terms were simple and terrifyingly specific. The object, referred to only as the asset, was to remain undisturbed at these precise coordinates until a claimant presented the matching half of the identifier code. There was no mention of money. There was only mention of duty. For 70 years, the Galloways had not been owners of this tractor, they had been jailers. Ewan looked up, and for the first time, the weariness in his eyes was replaced by a dawn of understanding. The stories his great-uncle had mumbled in his final days, the warnings about the iron ghost, the refusal to let the scrap men near it, it hadn't been madness. It had been adherence to a contract so binding it had outlived the man who signed it. The weight of the tractor suddenly seemed to double, sinking deeper into the mud in his mind. He wasn't just looking at scrap metal, he was looking at a promise kept. "You have the other half?" Ewan asked, his voice rough, barely audible over the drumming of the rain on the metal hood. Owen didn't speak, he simply turned his wrist. On the cuff of his coat, he punched a sequence into a small, integrated keypad. A faint chime sounded, discordant and electronic against the natural noise of the valley. He held his wrist near the engine block, a mechanism inside the tractor, something that should have been seized by rust decades ago, clicked. It was a dull, heavy sound, like a bolt sliding home in a deep vault. "The contract is concluded," Owen said. His voice was calm, devoid of triumph. It was the voice of an accountant closing a ledger. "Your family is released." Ewan handed back the paper. He stepped back, wiping the rain from his face. He felt lighter, as if the gravity in the field had shifted. He had expected a transaction, a negotiation. Instead, he had been given an absolution. He nodded once, turned his back on the machine, and began the long walk back to the farmhouse. He didn't look back. He knew better than to watch what happened next. With the paperwork acknowledged, the real work began. With the landowner's retreat, the sphere of privacy around the machine was finally complete. Owen did not immediately touch the tractor. Instead, he waited until the figure of Ewan had disappeared into the grey mist of the tree line, ensuring that the only witness to what came next would be the rain. He unzipped the waterproof lining of his coat, not to retrieve a wrench or a crowbar, tools that would have made sense in this setting, but to withdraw a sleek, hard-shell case made of matte carbon fibre. It was the size of a tablet computer, and when he cracked the seal, the interior glowed with a soft, sterile blue light that seemed violently out of place against the mud and the moss. He lifted out a device that looked like a skeletal caliper, laced with sensors and optical lenses. It was a density scanner, a prototype from his own laboratories, designed to look through layers of concrete to find faults in server farm foundations. Here, in a sheep paddock, it was being repurposed for archaeology. He raised the device, sweeping it slowly over the rusted cowling of the Ferguson. A grid of red laser light fanned out, painting the corroded metal in a digital topography. To the naked eye, the tractor was a mess of oxidation. To the scanner, it was a lie. Owen stepped closer, wiping a patch of wet moss from the side of the engine block. The metal beneath was rough, pitted, and stained the colour of dried paprika. It looked like cast iron that had surrendered to the elements. But as he adjusted the frequency of the scanner, the readout on his wrist told a different story. The oxidation was uniform. It was perfectly, mathematically consistent, exactly 3 millimeters deep across the entire surface. Rust is a chaotic process. It eats metal in random patterns, digging deep pits where water pools and leaving other areas relatively untouched. This rust had no chaos in it. It was a coating. It was a skin grown over the true structure to camouflage it from the world. He moved to the engine block itself. In a standard 1950s tractor, this would be a complex assembly of gaskets, manifolds and spark plugs, a breathing mechanical heart designed to turn fossil fuel into torque. Owen leaned in, his breath pluming in the cold air. The shape was right. The silhouette mimicked the standard combustion engines of the era perfectly, but the details were wrong. Where there should have been seams between the cylinder head and the block, there was only continuous metal. Where there should have been bolts to allow a mechanic to strip the engine down, there were only the heads of bolts. He ran his thumb over one of these bolt heads. It didn't sit flush. He applied pressure, and it didn't budge. He took a small magnetic probe from his kit and touched it to the bolt. The reading was neutral. These weren't fasteners holding two plates together, they were part of the casting. They were decorative. The entire engine block wasn't a collection of parts, it was a single, solid monocoque structure. It had been manufactured, or grown, as one piece, a sealed casing with no way in and no way out. The bolts had been welded shut from the inside, a manufacturing impossibility for 1950s metallurgy. Owen deactivated the scanner and slipped his glove off his right hand. He needed to feel it. The air in the valley was freezing, hovering just above zero, and the rain was ice cold. By all laws of thermodynamics, the metal of the tractor should have been a heat sink, leaching the warmth from anything that touched it. He placed his bare palm flat against the side of the chassis. It wasn't cold. It wasn't warm either. It was completely room temperature, maintaining a steady equilibrium that ignored the weather entirely. The sensation was unnerving, like touching a living thing that was pretending to be a stone. The texture, too, was deceptive. Beneath the rough, artificial texture of the rust, the material felt slick, almost oily, with a density that repelled the water. The rain didn't streak down the side of the engine block. It beaded up and rolled off instantly, as if the material itself was hydrophobic at a molecular level. This was an alloy that didn't exist in the periodic table of 1953. It was a composite that belonged in the nose cone of a re-entry vehicle, not sitting in a field in the Scottish Highlands. Then came the sound, or rather the absence of it. As Owen kept his hand pressed against the metal, the acoustic profile of the valley shifted. The drumming of the rain on his hood seemed to recede, pushed back to a distance of 10 feet. The wind, which had been whistling through the dry stone walls, fell silent in his immediate vicinity. It was a dampening field, a subtle manipulation of frequency that created a bubble of stillness. It was a silence with weight, a pressure that built up in the inner ear. The birdsong from the nearby woods cut out, the bleating of the sheep faded. For a moment, it was just Owen and the machine, existing in a vacuum of their own making. He pulled his hand back, and the world rushed in again, the wind, the water, the noise. He looked at his palm. It was dry. He looked back at the tractor. It sat there, innocent and dilapidated, the perfect picture of agricultural decay. But the illusion had been broken. This machine had never ploughed a furrow. It had never pulled a harvest. It was a safe, designed by a paranoia so deep it required 70 years of patience. The tractor was not a vehicle, it was a shell. And like all shells, it was built to protect something soft and vital at its centre. Owen took a step back, the realization settling on him like the rain. The extraction wouldn't be a repair job, it would be a bank heist. To understand the silence of the valley, one must first understand the noise that birthed it. The local parish records for October 14, 1953, make note of a severe electrical storm that kept the villagers in their homes, shutters drawn against the flashing sky. But there was no thunder that night. There was no rain either, not at first. The flashes that lit up the glen in strobing, silent bursts were not lightning. They were the byproducts of an unstable ionization field, a localized atmospheric disturbance caused by a truck moving slowly up the single-track road with its headlights off. The vehicle was a military surplus transport, its suspension groaning under a load that defied its size. Driving it was a man whose face would never appear in any history book, but whose mind had already reshaped the trajectory of the 20th century. He was an engineer, a defector from the rigid dogmas of the establishment, fleeing the very government he had sworn to serve. He was not alone. Sitting beside him, clutching a Geiger counter that clicked like a frantic clock, was a younger Alistair Galloway. Galloway was not yet the bitter old man who would chase scrap dealers with a shotgun. That night, he was a co-conspirator, a man terrified by what sat in the cargo bed behind him, yet bound by a loyalty that outweighed his fear. They stopped in the middle of the paddock, the mud churning beneath the heavy tires. The object they unloaded was not large, no bigger than a medicine ball, but it required a block and tackle to move. It radiated a heat that turned the damp Scottish air into instant steam, creating a shroud of mist that hid their work from the valley below. This was the prototype, a device that shouldn't have existed. In the paranoid freeze of the Cold War, where power was measured in megatons and mutually assured destruction, this object represented a different kind of danger. It was a power source that didn't consume fuel, generating a thermal output that terrified the men loading it. But it was unstable. It was leaking, not radiation, but something else, a dimensional resonance that warped the air around it. It couldn't be kept in a city, it couldn't be kept in a lab. It needed to be buried in the middle of nowhere, encased in a material dense enough to dampen its song. The engineer had spent the last of his fortune fabricating a solution that would hide in plain sight. He didn't build a bunker. Bunkers attract attention. He built a tractor. The Ferguson was a masterpiece of deception. The engineer had cast the chassis from a lead-tungsten alloy scavenged from a defunct reactor project. The engine block was a hollowed-out sarcophagus, lined with graphite and silver, designed to hold the core and dissipate its heat into the earth through the tires. They worked through the night, the strange, silent lightning flaring around them as they lowered the core into the belly of the machine. When they sealed the bolts, welding them from the inside using a frequency welder the engineer had invented for this sole purpose, the heat stopped. The mist vanished. The clicking of the Geiger counter fell silent. The storm ended as abruptly as it had begun, leaving only a bright orange tractor sitting innocuously in the field. The engineer left before dawn. He told Galloway that he would return when the technology of the world had caught up to what was buried in the field. He said it might take 10 years, or it might take 100. He left behind a single document, the deed of release, and a son who was only an infant, sleeping in a crib 3,000 miles away. That engineer was Owen's father. He never came back. He died in a car accident 2 years later, a casualty of a world that wasn't ready for his truths. The tractor remained, a vault disguised as a relic, holding its breath while the seasons turned over it. It had held its integrity for 70 years, acting as a dam against the future. But even the strongest dam eventually begins to crack, and the vault was finally open. The solitude of the valley was officially ended by the arrival of the support team. They did not come from the road. They descended from the hovering aircraft on winches, two figures clad in the same matte black technical gear as Owen. They carried cases that were heavy, reinforced, and stamped with hazard warnings that had no place in an agricultural setting. This was not a recovery operation. It was a surgical intervention. They did not speak to Owen, nor did he issue verbal commands. The protocol had been established long before the helicopter left the tarmac in California. They moved with the synchronized efficiency of a pit crew servicing a race car, but the vehicle in question was a rusted relic that hadn't moved since the coronation of Queen Elizabeth II. They set up a perimeter around the tractor, driving portable floodlights into the soft mud. The stark white LED beams cut through the gloom, stripping away the romantic atmosphere of the farm and leaving only the harsh reality of the work at hand. The tractor looked different under the lights, less like a ghost and more like a cadaver on a slab. The team unpacked their instruments, magnetic drills, plasma cutters, and acoustic dampeners. They were not here to lift the tractor onto a flatbed. They were here to dissect it. The objective was not the machine itself, but the cavity within the engine block. The lead technician approached the side of the engine casing, marking a precise square with a grease pencil. He attached a magnetic drill press to the cast iron frame. The magnet engaged with a heavy thud. He inserted a bit tipped with industrial diamond, designed to bore through hardened steel like it was pine wood. He looked at Owen for the final nod. Owen gave it. The technician engaged the motor. The sound that followed was a shriek, a high-pitched mechanical scream that tore through the quiet of the glen. But it lasted less than 3 seconds. There was a sharp crack, followed by the dull clatter of metal hitting the ground. The drill bit had shattered. It hadn't just snapped, it had disintegrated, the diamond tip pulverized by the material it was trying to cut. The technician inspected the surface of the tractor. There wasn't even a scratch. The rust had been polished away by the friction, revealing a glimpse of that strange, oily grey alloy beneath, completely unmarred. The metal was fighting back. They switched tactics. The second technician brought forward a thermal lance, a tool that uses pressurized oxygen and iron filings to burn through concrete and steel at temperatures hot enough to liquefy rock. He ignited the tip, the flame roaring to life with a blinding white intensity. He applied it to the seam of the engine block. The mud around the tractor began to steam, the water evaporating instantly. But the metal of the tractor did not melt. It didn't even glow red. It absorbed the heat, dispersing it so rapidly across its molecular structure that the surface remained cool to the touch, just inches from the flame. The laws of thermodynamics were being treated as suggestions rather than rules. As the team struggled against the impossible metallurgy, the environment began to react to the intrusion. The low pressure of the valley bottom dropped further. The rain, which had been a constant morning drizzle, suddenly hardened. It turned to sleet, and then, within moments, to hail. Stones of ice the size of marbles began to bombard the site, hammering against the metal hood of the tractor and the helmets of the crew. It was as if the valley itself was rejecting the surgery, the weather turning violent in a desperate attempt to keep the seal intact. The wind howled through the stone walls, tearing at the floodlights, creating a strobe effect of light and shadow that made the tractor seem to vibrate. Owen stepped forward, signalling the team to stop. Brute force was the wrong key for this lock. He reached into the case he had brought and retrieved a small sonic emitter. He placed it directly against the weld line that had defied the drill and the fire. He adjusted the frequency, tuning it to the resonance of the alloy, a frequency his father had noted in the margins of a notebook 70 years ago. The sound was inaudible to the human ear, but the effect was immediate. The hail continued to pound the earth, but the tractor began to hum. The vibration started deep within the chassis. The rust on the engine block began to flake off in large, scab-like sheets, falling away to reveal the pristine, dark metal underneath. Then, with a sound like a cracking glacier, the weld gave way. A hairline fracture appeared along the side of the block. It widened, not from external force, but from internal release. The casing cracked open. There was no explosion. There was only a pressurized hiss, a sudden exhalation of air that had been trapped inside since 1953. The gas hit the faces of the men, carrying a scent that stopped them in their tracks. It didn't smell of oil or diesel or the wet rot of the farm. It smelled of ozone. It smelled of sterile, ionized air, of high-voltage laboratories and vacuum tubes. It was the smell of a sealed room that had been waiting for a visitor. The wind died down as quickly as it had risen. The hail stopped. The shell was broken and the heart of the mystery lay exposed to the grey Scottish light. The side of the engine block didn't just open, it surrendered. The iron plate, heavy with the phantom weight of 70 years, slid free and landed in the mud with a wet, heavy thud that sounded like a final punctuation mark. The technicians stepped back, their breath caught in the sudden vacuum of sound, their floodlights training their beams into the dark cavity that had been revealed. Inside the rusted, hollowed-out chest of the Ferguson tractor, there was no grease, no pistons, and no crankshaft. There was only a cradle of silver mesh suspending a single object in the center of the void. It was a sphere, roughly the size of a human heart, composed of a material that defied the surrounding gloom. It was black, but not the flat, lifeless black of paint or plastic. It was the deep, drinking black of obsidian or a collapsed star, a surface that seemed to absorb the photons from the LED lights rather than reflect them. It sat there, perfectly spherical, unblemished by the decades of damp and cold that had eaten the rest of the machine. It was a drop of absolute perfection in a sea of decay. And it was humming. The sound was low, a sub-bass thrum that was felt in the marrow of the bone rather than heard by the ear. It was the idle noise of a machine that had been left in standby mode for a lifetime, waiting for the command to wake. Owen moved closer, his face illuminated by the faint, violet corona that seemed to bleed from the object's surface. This was the black box. In the sanitized history of his company, this device was a myth, a theoretical model sketched on a napkin by a brilliant founder who died too young. But in the reality of the rain-soaked field, it was terrifyingly physical. It was not a battery, and it was not a weapon. It was a seed. His father had understood that the hardware of 1953 was too crude to handle the data structures he had envisioned. He couldn't build the computer he needed, so he built the storage medium and set it to run a recursive, self-optimizing algorithm. He had buried it in the earth like a time capsule, allowing the crystal lattice inside to grow, to organize itself, to mature in the dark. For 70 years, while the world moved from vacuum tubes to silicon chips, from dial-up to fiber optics, this sphere had been sitting in the dark, thinking. It had been refining its own internal architecture, building a neural network of infinite density, waiting for the day when the external world had the interface technology capable of speaking to it. The tech giant Owen ran, with all its server farms and quantum labs, had hit a wall. They had reached the physical limits of silicon. They were building towers of Babel that couldn't reach the sky. They needed a new foundation. They needed the thing that was humming inside this tractor. Owen didn't smile. There was no triumph in his expression, no fist raised to the sky. Instead, his shoulders dropped. The tension that had held him upright, the rigid posture of the CEO, seemed to dissolve. He looked like a man who had been carrying a heavy stone for miles and had finally been told he could put it down. He reached out with gloved hands, not to take the sphere, but to hover near it, verifying its reality. The relief on his face was profound. It was the validation of a lifetime of whispers, the proof that the ghost story he had been told as a child was actually a history lesson. The implication of this moment was invisible to the technicians, who saw only a strange rock in a tractor. But for Owen, the balance of global power had just shifted. The empire he controlled was built on the promise of the next leap forward. They had sold the future to their investors, but until this moment, they hadn't actually owned it. The sphere was the missing variable. It was the bridge between the digital and the organic, the ghost in the machine that would render every other processor on Earth obsolete overnight. The extraction wasn't just a retrieval, it was a transfusion. The heart of the old world was being cut out to keep the new world alive. Possession is 9/10 of the law, they say, But in the world of high technology, possession is nothing. Understanding is everything. And as Owen prepared the containment unit, he knew that the long waiting was finally over. The transfer of the object was performed with the delicacy of a surgical explant. Owen did not touch the sphere with his naked hands. He utilized a magnetic grapple extended from the containment unit, lifting the obsidian heart from its iron cradle. As the sphere floated upward, hovering in the damp air before settling into the padded interior of the carbon fiber case, the atmosphere in the paddock underwent a violent shift. The low-frequency hum that had vibrated in the marrow of their bones ceased instantly. The air, which had felt charged and electric, collapsed back into the heavy, wet reality of a standard Highland autumn. The tractor, stripped of its secret, seemed to visibly slump. For 70 years, the Ferguson had possessed a posture that defied the gravity of its age, held up by the strange energy pulsing within its frame. Now, in the blink of an eye, it was just a carcass. The metal looked duller, the orange paint flatter. The rust seemed to reclaim its victory, the decay accelerating to catch up with lost time. It was a shell that had lost its pearl, a mundane ruin that would now sink quietly into the earth, indistinguishable from any other scrap metal in the county. It was no longer a vault, nor was it a sentinel standing guard over history. It was merely a collection of oxidized parts that had been left out in the rain too long. The spirit had been harvested, leaving only the husk. Owen sealed the case, the locks engaged with a pneumatic hiss that sounded final. He signalled to his team, and the breakdown of the site began immediately. The floodlights were doused, the drills packed away, the cables coiled. The theatre of the operation was dismantled with ruthless efficiency, leaving the stage empty and dark. Before he boarded the aircraft, Owen walked once more to the edge of the field, where Ewan stood watching from the shadows of the byre. There were no handshakes, for this was not a meeting of friends. Owen simply handed the landowner a small, heavy envelope. Inside was a cashier's cheque with a figure that would fix the leaking roof, pay the generational debts, and ensure that the Galloways never needed to sell the land to strangers. But it was also a price paid for amnesia. The transaction ensured that the events of this night would remain as they had always been, a local legend easily dismissed as the ramblings of old men. Ewan took the envelope and nodded once. He understood the terms implicitly. The tractor was his again, but it was just dead weight now. The ghost was gone. The helicopter engines whined to life, the noise shattering the peace of the glen one last time. The downwash flattened the wet grass, sending ripples through the muddy puddles and shaking the briars. Owen did not look out the window as the machine lifted into the grey sky. He was already looking at the case on the seat beside him, his mind racing towards the clean rooms of California. The aircraft banked sharp and turned south, becoming a shrinking dot against the clouds, until the sound of its rotors faded into the wind. The valley was left alone. The artificial lights were gone. The high-tech intrusion had vanished, as if it had never occurred. The sheep, disturbed by the noise, began to slowly drift back toward the shelter of the walls. The smell of ozone dissipated, replaced once again by the scent of wet wool and peat. The tension that had held the landscape taut for 7 decades dissolved, leaving behind a profound, empty quiet. The history had been extracted, the contract was fulfilled. All that remained was the rain, falling on a world that had returned to its slow, inevitable decay. The rain began to pool in the empty cavity of the engine block, filling the space where the heart used to be. It mixed with the rust, turning the water a dark, bloody orange. The past is always fueling the future, usually without credit. If you want to uncover more histories hidden in plain sight, Subscribe to Fabled Legacies. The mystery is over and the silence returned, this time for good.